When people visit the National Gallery, as about 4.5 million do every year, they come in from the fumes, noise, and movement of the London traffic to a world which, unless you happen to coincide with a particularly excitable group of visitors, gives an impression of serenity. Here, in the eternal springtime of the air conditioning, it seems that you can sit or stand in peace, looking at the pictures, exploring the timeless world of the great masters. But while great art may indeed be about enduring truths, pictures themselves are rarely as serene or secure as they appear to be. They are, after all, things, complex objects, carefully made but inherently vulnerable, that have survived across many centuries and frequently bear the scars of their experiences. When Keats, after saying that a thing of beauty is a joy forever, goes on to add that its loveliness increaseth, you do have to wonder whether he himself ever had to worry about the well-being of pictures. Here, for instance, the damage was probably caused by a steady drip of water. But as you walk around the gallery, you can see pictures which have been sawn up and pulled apart to be more easily sold, or cut into pieces because the canvas they were painted on had irrecoverably rotted. Even when the pictures are clearly still whole, the more closely you look at them, the less serene, the less unchanging they become. Take, for instance, Rubens's beguiling portrait, almost certainly of his sister-in-law, Suzanne London. For over 350 years, she has been shyly caught in the cool Flanders sunshine, quietly averting her gaze from the spectator. But the more you look at her, the more disturbing the picture becomes. Stand a little longer, look a little more closely at her sleeves and her dress, and you can see that they're much less composed than the sitter herself. There's a disturbing line at the bottom of the portrait and at the side, and on either side of the line, the color slightly changes. Is this the way the picture was meant to look? Is this what Rubens wanted us to see? To answer questions like this, and almost every picture in the gallery will pose such questions if looked at long enough, we have to get close to the way that the pictures were made and what they were made with. To think of them not just as things of great beauty, but as things that changed both while being made and after they'd left the artist's studio. A panel like this one, for instance, was made out of several planks of wood, cut from an oak tree like this, then worked with tools like the ones behind me, and glued together to make a surface for painting on. It was made in the 1620s by Michiel Frindt, and we can see his initials MV. And above the initials, we can see the coat of arms of the city of Antwerp, which shows that it was seen and approved by the Panel Makers Guild of the city. As you can see, it's made of several pieces of wood. 3 equal vertical strips here, a 4th, thinner strip at the side, and a broad 5th piece at the bottom. And that makeup of the panel explains something very interesting about the front. It explains the discrepancy in color that we noticed when we looked at the picture hanging in the gallery. You can now see that Rubens originally painted his sister-in-law on the 3 equal pieces of wood that we saw at the back. He later expanded the composition, adding the strip at the side and the other strip here at the bottom. The original portrait was painted right up to the edge of the panel, so it must have been painted out of the frame. But on the additional strips, you can see a tiny area of unpainted wood around the side, suggesting that Rubens painted the full portrait when it was already framed and his brush was unable to get right to the edge of the panel. And you can also see that he's had a little difficulty in matching exactly the color of the original to the color of the additions, a discrepancy that's almost certainly grown with age. As you walk through the galleries, you find many other pictures that aren't quite what they seem. Take, for instance, Veronese's vision of St. Helena. According to legend, it was St. Helena who, a few centuries after the event, discovered the true cross on which Christ had been crucified. Veronese shows her having a vision of that true cross carried by angels. Now, she had the vision, of course, in the sunny Mediterranean. So why do we see her now set against a chill grey sky that looks much more appropriate in the east coast of Scotland? And even as a grey sky, it looks pretty peculiar, because in front of the grey are floating white clouds. In Gossard's Adoration of the Kings, painted in Flanders in the 1510s, every detail has been meticulously painted and appears perfectly preserved. Whether it's the hairy wart on the kneeling king's cheek, the tassel on his hat, or the scepter with the tiny figure of Moses and the tablets of the law. But if we look at the left-hand side of the painting, the red robe of the king is disfigured with black diagonal hatching, while the broken stones at his feet appear to be run through by lines that carry on the grid of the pavement. What are we actually seeing? Even a picture as familiar as Renoir's umbrellas, for example, begins to cause us disquiet once we look at it a little more closely. On the right-hand side, the two women and the two girls all have in their clothes at some point a rich, vivid blue. And they're painted in Renoir's fluid, feathery manner, the conscious charm of the handling, emphasizing the all too conscious appeal of the little girl with the hoop. But the woman on the left-hand side appears to come from a completely different world. She's painted with smoother, broader strokes of the brush, and her dress is a duller, grayer blue, except below the box that she's carrying, where the two tones of blue seem to combine uneasily. What is going on in this picture? It's the sort of question that in the gallery we can really only ask. But if we can take the picture upstairs to the scientific department and the conservation studio, take it out of its frame, and look at it as we can look at pictures behind the scenes, so to speak, then I think we can get close to some answers. One of the remarkable things about the National Gallery is its long tradition of pioneering research in understanding how pictures were made. It's a history that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. From the 1850s, it was clear that the polluted atmosphere of central London was potentially dangerous for the paintings. But Parliament did not want to move the pictures out to the suburbs, where the air would have been cleaner, because that would have made it very difficult for the working population to see them. And it was for the pleasure and education of that working population that the gallery had been set up. Instead, Parliament recommended that the gallery seek scientific advice to try to establish exactly how the pictures might be being affected by the smoke and the fumes. As a result, the gallery has a unique tradition of conservators and scientists working closely with art historians in the study and conservation of the paintings to keep the collection safe for the future. And in the process of caring for the pictures, we have also learned a great deal about the artist's original intentions, or, in the case of Renoir's umbrellas, his changing intentions. One of the first things you can see with the picture out of its frame is that it's been reduced in size. Because whereas on the right-hand side, the paint surface ends at the edge, on the left-hand side, as you can see, the painted canvas has been carried round the side of the stretcher. And as you look carefully at that edge that's been turned, you can see there's a difference between the edge and the front. The umbrella at the left, for example, goes all the way to the edge of the picture as we see it. But when we look round the edge, we find not the paint of the umbrella, but a quite different kind of paint, probably representing the trees we can still see on the front. So the umbrella was clearly put in at a later stage. And as we come down this added strip to the bottom, we find the beginnings of the answer to the question that troubled us in the gallery about the difference between the left and the right-hand treatment of the women. Down here on the edge of the canvas, we can see the more vivid blue and the loose feathery strokes that we found on the blue dresses of the women on the right. It's as if the paint on the right-hand side had once run all the way across and then later been covered by the duller, greyer paint. That's about as far as we can get looking at the surface of the picture. But if we go below the surface and use an X-ray, then we can get quite a lot further.
This is the composite X-ray of the umbrellas, and it consists of the 20 individual X-ray sheets which have been pasted together. That's why you can see there are various horizontal and vertical lines where the sheets overlap. But what's really interesting is the way it shows the paint. Over on the right-hand side, the feathery network of brushstrokes of the bonnet and the little girl's head and her dress are very easy to match up with the paint you see on the surface of the picture. But for the woman on the left, she has a very similar network of feathery brushstrokes, whereas looking at the picture, the woman's dress now has a completely different texture to what it looks as if it has in the X-ray, and also completely different to the right-hand side. It's now covered with a much smoother, harder sort of painting, with very few brush strokes visible. And there are several differences around the woman's head. It's very obvious that at one time she was wearing a ruffle collar, which is now dark blue. And what's particularly obvious is that she was originally wearing some sort of a white hat or veil, which comes some way above where the top of her head now is. And in fact, her head was at a different, more upright angle in the first version, and she had a quite different sort of expression, perhaps with her mouth slightly open, possibly happier.
So the X-rays confirm that the paint on the left was once the same as the paint on the right. We can test this idea by taking from a small area of damage in the painting a tiny sample of paint or a cross-section. The sample is then prepared for examination with a microscope, where it can be viewed at around 250 times magnification.
What I'm looking at is the cross-section made from the paint sample I took from the lower part of the dress of the woman on the left. And what it shows is a number of layers of paint. At the bottom, 3 layers of paint containing this very rich, intense blue, cobalt blue. And this is the pigment that we find just in the first stage of the picture, and it's seen in the clothes of the figure group on the right as well. And this point is where Renoir paused and abandoned the composition. And when he returned to it, he used a quite different blue, and you can see that in the upper layers. What he first did was he applied a pinkish mauve paint over this cobalt blue, and then a final layer of paint containing a quite different blue-grey pigment that you see on the top here. And this is the layer that you see at the surface of the dress of the woman on the left.
We can fairly confidently say that the passages painted with the light feathery strokes were complete around 1880 by comparing them with other works by Renoir, while the broader, flatter brushstrokes are characteristic of his work around 1885. Between these two dates, he had been to Rome, and on the way back had stayed in Provence with Cézanne. And indeed, the flatter, broader brushstrokes of the woman's dress on the left are quite close to those that Cézanne used in his hillside in Provence of the middle 1880s. the surface and form of the rocks in the Cézanne, for instance, are surprisingly similar to what we see in the Renoir. The addition of the umbrellas, which, as we saw, are from the later date, suggests a desire for a more structured, more geometric composition, a shift in Renoir from the agitated surface of Impressionism to the calmer patterns of a more traditional kind of painting. And this suggested sequence of dates can, I think, be confirmed by the fashions we see. The women on the right are dressed in the high fashion of 1880. The woman on the left in a simpler, more severe style that was already slightly outmoded by 1885. Renoir then, in changing the woman at the left, has altered not just her style, but her class. He's suppressed her hat and her lace ruff. He's dressed her in a simpler, less fashionable dress. And what he's presenting us with now is not a well-heeled bourgeoise like the woman on the right, but an altogether poorer, more vulnerable young woman, possibly a shop worker to judge by the box that she's carrying, who should perhaps be careful not to respond to the rather doubtful attentions of the man behind her. The second version of the picture, the one we now see, with its clear divide between left and right, presents a more complex view of urban life and reveals tensions that are almost as much social as artistic. It seems that Renoir never resolved these tensions. The picture appears never to have been exhibited, and it's perhaps not surprising that the artist never again attempted a large-scale representation of life in the modern city. As we have seen, the questions raised by Renoir's umbrellas can in large measure be answered thanks to X-rays and cross-sections. There is, however, yet another method which allows us to see below the surface of a picture. This is the studio where we look at pictures in infrared, which, depending on how a painting is made, can allow us to look through the paint surface and see any preparatory drawing underneath. What we're looking at the moment is Gossart's Adoration of the Kings, the picture we saw in the gallery, and in particular at the king's red robe with its puzzling black marks.
If you look at this area of the king's robe in infrared, the underdrawing shows particularly clearly. If I just show you on the picture. This is the part of the robe where in the gallery you could see zigzaggy lines. If we look in infrared, we can now see very much more clearly that these are in fact underdrawing done by Gossart before he started painting to place the figures and to indicate areas of light and shade. But here we have a major fold, and there's some quite careful hatching beside that to show the shadow of the fold in the drapery. But these much wilder zigzaggy lines are in fact over the whole of this large area of drapery to indicate that this was to be in the shadow cast by the king. If we look in infrared, we can actually see Gossart working out where his figures are going to go and how they're going to look. And this area of the king's crown and hat, if you look on the painting, looks absolutely perfect. You wouldn't know that there was anything going on beneath. But in infrared, we can see that in fact the pointy bit of the king's hat was a late addition that has been painted after a lot of the rest of the painting is complete. And the cone is painted over the painting for the stonework of the building behind. And even the mortar courses and this little chip out of one of the stones was painted before the cone of the hat was put in. There are a number of changes that happen in this part of the picture. Two of the attendants behind the king have been changed at quite a late stage in the preparation as well. And it's possible that having turned these two men round and made them more prominent, the king himself didn't seem big enough in comparison, so to give him a tall, pointy hat actually, again, brings him into the foreground and makes him a larger character.
So by now, you can probably guess what's going on in the bottom left-hand corner. Gossart has mapped out the perspective plan of the paving stones before choosing to dislodge one or two, perhaps to suggest that the birth of Christ has overturned the established order. And what about St. Helena, whom we saw having her drab vision below an un-Mediterranean sky?
What you're looking at is a paint cross-section from the sky of St. Helena. And overall, the paint of the sky looks quite grey, as the sky is on the picture. But if you look carefully, you can see under the surface, there are here a pair of quite bright blue particles, and there the colour survives in the pigment. Now, what's happened is that Veronese has used a pigment called smalt, which is a blue glass pigment, and it was the cheapest way of painting blue in the mid-16th century. But it suffers a particular fault, and that is that it tends to lose its colour with time. And we've been having the picture photographed in order to do a computer simulation and reconstruct the original colour of the sky.
We've acquired an image of this painting using one of the world's first high-resolution digital cameras, and we now have that in the computer with the sky as it appears in the painting now. What we're trying to do is to recreate the colour of the sky before the smalt that Veronese used discoloured. The first step is to extract the region of sky that we're interested in, and we do this by making this silhouette. And then we use information from samples of smalt that we've prepared in the laboratory to try and recreate the colour. And after we've changed the blue in the sky and reinserted the figures, we get this result, which you can see. And you can see that the clouds are preserved. And the tonal balance is much better. The blue of the sky, the red and yellow in the robe, giving much more contrast than the rather similar colours now of the sky and the dress.
There is nothing that we can now do to recover the blue that Veronese once painted. There's no chemical means of reviving it, and Veronese's paint itself is still there. We can't paint over it. So we simply have to live with the picture as it now is, knowing that it's no longer true to Veronese's intentions. A picture like the St. Helena reminds us that every painting is really a dialogue between the artist and his materials. If those materials are unstable or change, then what he communicates will be distorted, often in ways that he could not have foreseen. The materials will determine how accurately we can now receive his meaning, but they will also, in very large measure, determine what he decides to paint. Let me finish by giving an example of what I mean. How three artists painting in different centuries with different materials address the same problem, the painting of water. When, in the 1380s, the Florentine artist, probably Niccolo di Pietro Gerini, painted the baptism of Christ, he had to tackle the question of a figure standing up to its knees in water. Now, this is a tricky proposition because water has awkward optical qualities. The artist knew only how to paint using pigments bound in egg yolk, an approach which gives very beautiful results, particularly of colour. But it is almost impossible, painting with egg, which gives a matte effect, to catch the fall of light on water, the gleam of the surface. And so the artist doesn't try to do this at all. Instead, he focuses on its transparency. With a series of thin lines, he gives the effects of the rippling surface. And then he shows us that we're looking through it by painting Christ's feet and legs with fish swimming around them. It's an eminently sensible and a very pleasing solution to a particular visual problem, given the materials that the artist had at his command. Almost 2 centuries later, Rembrandt addressed the same problem of a figure standing in water. Although it's a very different figure, probably Hendrika Stoffels, his mistress, it did, of course, present exactly the same visual problems. But Rembrandt, painting in Amsterdam in the 1650s, had at his disposal pigments bound not in egg yolk, but in vegetable oil. And oil paint is particularly good at rendering sheen and shimmer. And so, with the Rembrandt, we see nothing of Hendrika's feet and ankles, let alone the fish in the stream. But Rembrandt focuses instead on the reflections and on the dark, gleaming, slightly threatening surface of the river itself. It's an area of visual experience that can be explored only in oil paint, one that simply was not accessible to the Florentine artists of the Baptism. And 2 centuries later still, when Renoir, around 1880, wanted to paint the surface of water, he could address the question differently again, because he had new kinds of paint to work with. Advances in chemistry in the 19th century had led to the discovery of new elements and the manufacture of new paints with an intensity of hue hardly ever seen before. Exploiting these modern pigments, Renoir puts cobalt blue beside chrome yellow and chrome orange to capture yet another quality of the surface of water. He paints, almost for the first time, dazzle. What emerges from this is, I think, simple but fascinating. Artists can paint only what their materials allow them to paint. And as materials change, artists will tend to exploit the new possibilities they offer to paint not just different things, but quite different kinds of subject. That relationship between artists and materials, how the work of art, the masterpiece, emerges from the things that artists have at their disposal, is what we should be looking at in the next few programs. What is the purpose of painting? I suspect that most of us, looking around the National Gallery, would hesitate to give a snap answer to that question. But Cennino Cennini, writing in Florence in the 1390s, had no doubt at all. It is, he said, to discover things not seen, to give them form with the hand, and to present to plain sight what does not exist. No question here of the artist observing and recording the visible world. His job is quite explicitly to discover things not seen, to paint what does not exist. In other words, the artist is interested not in our place in this world, but our relationship with the next. Most of the artists of the day would, I suspect, have agreed with Cennino, and certainly the pictures in these rooms bear him out. In this program, I want to look at 2 pictures. In the 1390s, an unknown artist, painted this small portable altarpiece showing Richard II of England, supported by his three favourite saints, forever kneeling before the Christ child and the Virgin. And in 1370, in Florence, Jacopo di Cioni and his workshop made this huge altarpiece that shows Christ crowning the Virgin. It was painted for the church of San Pier Maggiore, St. Peter the Great, and St. Peter has quite literally taken up the little church. Painting the other world demanded, as we shall see, materials drawn from all over this world. Some, like the gold, very expensive, others surprisingly humble. Across the whole of Europe, these ingredients were treated and combined in broadly the same way to achieve the astonishing feat of bringing heaven down to earth, or alternatively, turning earth, and that sometimes meant real earth, into heaven. To look at how they did it, we have to begin at the beginning, with the wood they were painted on. And so we'll start by taking the main panels of the San Pier Maggiore altarpiece up to the conservation studio, where we can look at them properly. The altarpiece was a huge affair. On top of these three panels were 6 scenes of the life of Christ, and above that 3 pinnacles, the whole thing standing over 16 feet high. A picture like this is, in the first instance, not so much a work of art as a triumph of carpentry. We know from accounts that survive that designing this sort of altarpiece was skillful, highly paid work. Not all was done by the artist whose workshop ultimately painted it. We can't now be entirely sure how this huge freestanding structure was kept stable and upright. There must have been an elaborate system of struts, battens, and braces to keep the whole thing together and to make sure that it didn't fall over onto the priest officiating at the altar below. What is clear from the back is that it's entirely made of poplar. Now, this gets things off to a pretty bad start. Poplar is full of knots, coarse-grained, and likely to warp and split. It's also peculiarly prone to woodworm, beetle, dry rot, and fungus. In short, it's very far from being the ideal wood for this kind of painting. Nowadays, poplar is used principally for making matchsticks, which gives you a pretty good idea of its quality. But in 14th century Italy, it was the only wood easily available to artists in large quantities. Once the wood had been shaped into panels like this, what did the artist do next? It's fairly clear looking at these bits of poplar that before you could paint them or put gold leaf onto them, you would need to do a lot of work preparing the surface. And luckily, the Florentine artist Cennino Cennini, in his Craftsman's Handbook, tells us exactly what you need to do to make an altarpiece like this. And examining this picture and many others, we have found every stage that Cennino describes, so that now, in the National Gallery, we're able to reconstruct the process in some detail. First, the panel must be coated with a glue made from sheep or goat skin boiled to a jelly. Or, as Cennino put it, it must be given an aperitif to prepare it for its dinner. For Cennino is very much the Mrs. Beeton of art manuals. Everything is compared to cookery, and appropriately so, because the artist in overall charge of a project like this is in no sense a lone creator. He's much more like the head chef in a grand restaurant, supervising a team of specialist cooks. A team, in this instance, drawn from the National Gallery's scientific and conservation departments. The next course, according to Cennino, is a piece of linen soaked in glue and laid onto the panel. This covers the joint in the wood and evens out the surface. It also provides a better base for the next stage, which is the application of gypsum, or gesso as the Italians call it, a mineral common in Tuscany. It is ground and mixed with animal glue, ideally the same glue already used on the panel. Cennino tells you to mix the gesso with your hand, as though you were making batter for pancakes, smoothly and deftly, so as not to get it too frothy. You may have to apply as many as 8 layers of gesso, or to give it its chemical name, hydrated calcium sulfate. You leave the layers of gesso to dry and harden, and then you scrape them down to give them an absolutely smooth finish on which gold leaf or paint can be applied. The panel would now be ready for the head chef and his team of gilders and painters. In this case, we think that the artist's overall charge was Jacopo di Cione, but he himself probably executed only the most visible and memorable parts. His first job would, of course, be to draw up the menu, that is, to plan the whole composition of the altarpiece. For this part, clearly, Christ crowning the Virgin would be center stage. And on their right, in the place of honor, would be St. Peter. It is, after all, his church. Once this is done, the next question to be decided is which bits of the surface are to be covered in gold and which in paint. This is more complicated than it might seem, because as well as the gold background, you have to sort out the halos. Every figure must have a halo, and so before work can begin, the position and the angle of every head has to be decided and drawn in the gesso. This can be tricky. If we look at St. Peter's head, for instance, we can see that the halo was originally continued further round than was necessary, was gilded and punched, and then later had to be painted over to put in his beard. The gold of halos and background is just that, pure gold, in fact, money. In the artist's workshop, the wealth of the world becomes the light of heaven. The gold florin, which was legal tender in Florence and was of 24-carat gold, was beaten out into wafer-thin sheets. In the 1390s, the florin weighed about 3.5 grams, and according to Cennino, you get best results if you hammer only 100 sheets of gold leaf from one florin. But thin gold laid down on a white ground will look rather greenish. So in order to make the gold leaf appear warm in color, like the solid metal, the gesso is first covered with bole, a greasy red clay mixed with a little glue. The thin gold leaves are then carefully laid down onto the red bowl. Once laid down, the gold still needs to be burnished, rubbed and polished until it is absolutely flat, using a gemstone, often hematite, sometimes agate. But Cennino, always drawn to the foie gras end of the cooking spectrum, recommends you use sapphires, emeralds, or rubies. But he does go on to say that if necessary, the tooth of a dog will also do. However achieved, the flattened, burnished gold will work like a gigantic mirror, reflecting the light of the candles burning below the altar, shining in the gloom of the church. Next comes what Cennino calls one of our most delightful branches. The gold of the halos is decorated with incised lines. There then follows tooling and ornamental punching. This is difficult, highly skillful work, and Cennino tells us it is best undertaken on a damp day, for the punch is then less likely to tear the gold leaf. The punching on the San Pier Maggiore altarpiece was done with very simple implements, only 5 or 6 plain ring or indenting punches. But every figure has a different halo, and your halo shows your status. As you would expect, Christ and the Virgin have the most elaborate, followed by the saints, while the simple angels at the front have to make do with small, rather workaday halos. Everything in this altarpiece is calculated to show the hierarchy of heaven. With the gilded framework in place, the painting can now begin. But first of all, you have to make your paints. Pigments are ground into powder and then reground with water to make a paste. Now, if you try to paint with a paste like this, the color will fall off as soon as it dries. You need to bind the pigments in a medium. And in 14th century Italy, for painting on wood, the preferred medium was eggs. An altarpiece like this took dozens of them. The surviving accounts show that more was paid for eggs than for 50 little pots to hold the paints. So, not surprisingly, any artist worth his salt had to know his egg yolks. According to Cennino, eggs laid by country hens had darker yolks, suitable for the flesh of swarthy and aged persons, while town eggs with paler yolks were suitable for pale young flesh. Areas of flesh were first laid in a pale green earth color to provide a cool undertone for the modeling. Broken egg yolks flow readily and smoothly, and as anybody who's ever washed up dishes knows, they dry very quickly and very hard. So only a small amount of egg tempera can be prepared at any one time. The man with the red paint pot, to avoid waste, must know all the areas of red that have to be covered in the whole altarpiece. and he's got to move fast, building up the colour with short, decisive brushstrokes. Modelling from dark to light within a single colour to give an impression of three-dimensionality must also be planned quite precisely. Giannino relies on a system of pre-mixed shades. Here, the darkest tone is pure vermilion, and the highlights are very pale pink, lead-white tinted with a tiny amount of vermilion. The deepest shadows are strengthened with a small amount of red lake. This system can, of course, be applied to any colour. And the colours themselves come from an extraordinary range of sources. The green earth used to underpaint flesh tones and the other earth colours can be literally picked out of the Italian soil. Vermilion, on the other hand, is the complex product of alchemy, a highly poisonous mercuric sulfide, which gives brilliant reds. But if the pigment is inexpertly ground, it will, with time, turn irreversibly black. If the strongest reds are mineral, softer, more crimson ones are likely to be animal or vegetable. The most prized red of all was derived from the secretions of scale insects, like these ones. And insects from Poland were particularly esteemed and were used for dyeing fabrics. The reds alone make it clear that a picture like this could be painted only in a great centre of trade, where pigments from very far away were easily available. It also helped the painter to live in a centre of manufacturing industry. If textile dyeing was important for some shades of red, the lead tin yellow of St. Peter's robe was associated with glassmaking. St. Peter's other colour, his refulgent blue, is made from the queen of all the pigments, ultramarine, the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli, which at this time was mined only in Afghanistan. In the finest quality of ultramarine, as seen here, it is by far the most expensive element of this altarpiece. Any contemporary viewer would have known at once what blues like this were worth. Real extravagance, of course, could go one or indeed two steps further. On top of any of the pigments, you could paint thin lines of adhesive and lay gold leaf on top so as to leave a gold pattern over the paint. An even richer effect could be achieved by the much more labor-intensive process of sgraffito. The whole area of drapery was first covered with gold leaf, which was then painted over. A pattern was then marked out, and the paint scraped away to reveal the gold beneath, which could then be punched to give the effect of real cloth of gold. The rarest and most expensive of textiles is imitated through the lavish expenditure of materials and skill. so that the court of heaven, in all its magnificence, could be made visible, almost tangible, to the worshippers at San Pier Maggiore. If you were rich enough, of course, you could enjoy an image of this relationship for your own personal use. And that's the function of this diptych. 2 small hinged panels that open and shut like a book. Because it was kept for years at Wilton House near Salisbury, it's known as the Wilton diptych. And it was painted about 25 years later than the San Pier Maggiore altarpiece, somewhere around 1395, and probably in England. In every essential respect, it's made in exactly the same way as the San Pier Maggiore altarpiece, but with vastly greater skill. Painted not on poplar, but on Northern European oak, the Wilton diptych was created not for public worship, but for the private devotion of a monarch. Richard II, King of England from 1377 to 1399, kneels on barren earth before the Virgin and Child who stand in the garden of heaven. Behind Richard are St. John the Baptist, St. Edward the Confessor, King of England and founder of Westminster Abbey, and St. Edmund, martyred King of East Anglia, killed by arrows. Richard wears his emblem, a white hart, and a collar of pods of the broom plant. And to show he is among friends, the elegant angels wear the same. The Christ child seems to be handing over a banner with the cross of St. George, England's national flag. Richard kneels, ready to receive from his God the authority to govern his kingdom. He will be the viceroy of Christ. Getting nearer, as only the private worshipper or the camera can, we see the goldsmith-like quality of the crowns and jewels, the lapis and gold sgraffito of Edmund's robe, and on the tiny orb above the flag, an island with a ship in the foreground and a castle behind, perhaps England. But it is the gold that dominates and beguiles. A single dot punch has set the moods of earth and heaven, shown the crown of thorns in the child's halo, and modelled his gold cloth. The Wilton diptych is an extraordinary achievement of egg and gold, halfway between painting and jewellery. But the unknown artist has yet another trick up his sleeve, one we discover only when we see the diptych as it was originally meant to be seen. By candlelight. The gold has clearly been applied and worked with a skillful knowledge of how it would read with candles burning in front of it. When we saw it in these conditions for the first time, as we were preparing for these programs, we discovered that in this respect, the making of the diptych had been carefully judged to underscore its central meaning. For a scene like this, 4 elements stand out: the halo of the Virgin, the robe of the Christ child, the crown of Richard II, and the miraculous ring of St. Edward the Confessor. And these are the most important elements in Richard's view of himself as king. He will rule as the representative of Christ, and England will be under the special protection of the Virgin, will, in the traditional phrase, be Mary's dowry. At his coronation in Westminster Abbey, which conferred this divine authority, Richard had himself been crowned with Edward the Confessor's crown. And Edward's ring was placed on his finger. The picture is the most elegant possible assertion that the English monarchy, whether its king be Edward the Confessor or Richard II, is under the particular protection of Christ and the Virgin. The Wilton diptych is an opulent, supremely moving statement of the divinity that doth hedge a king. Wood and glue, egg yolks, and laboriously ground pigments have been able to create an incomparable vision of what we believe, but in this life may not see. The court of heaven, in its splendid paradise garden, is brought into harmonious contact with earth, which remains barren, however richly the grand may dress to encounter eternity. But if the artist sets his sights lower and aims to show us not heaven but earth, then this way of painting with eggs and with gold is less satisfactory. Perfectly adapted to the light of faith, it struggles with the light of common day, and to paint the earth with its dark places as convincingly as heaven, the artist needs not eggs, but oil. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the next program.